Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. During the Trump administration, the American news media didn't just report the news, it became part of it. Headlines turned into battlegrounds, journalists were branded enemies, facts were called fake, and trust in the press hit historic lows. In an era of nonstop breaking news, social media outrage, and algorithm driven narratives, Americans weren't just divided by politics, they were divided by entirely different versions of reality. How the news media operated during the Trump years, what changed, what broke, what held firm, and what does it all mean for journalism and democracy moving forward? What happens when the institutions meant to inform a nation become one of its most contested arenas? That issue is next. I want to welcome back Dr. Diana Owen, Professor of Political Science at Georgetown University. She's also Director and Principal Investigator of the Civic Education Research Lab, also at Georgetown University. She is the author of several books. The latest book is The American Government and Politics in the Information Age. Dr. Owen, welcome back.
Thank you, Tony. It's wonderful to be here.
I want to start off with this. The last time you and I met, you had mentioned that there were several lawsuits coming down the pike, which they did. And we've seen a number of them against ABC, CBS, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, even YouTube. And I wanted to ask your opinion as to why do you think the print media has chosen to fight and the visual media, namely CBS and ABC, quite frankly, chose to settle, even though most scholars said they would have won their lawsuit in court.
Yeah, I think that's a question that a lot of people are asking. And I think that the reason was just to be expedient. These lawsuits really can, kind of clog up the system, but they also slow you down. They kind of, can hold the media back in terms of, what they can feel that they can do during that time. And I think that particularly during the early days of the Trump's second administration, his whole goal was to just get these lawsuits in there, kind of strike some sort of, kind of fear into not only media organizations, universities, and, other institutions he was going after. And there was a tendency kind of early on, especially to try and settle and kind of move past it, thinking that this was, going to be something that was going to happen in the long term. And so to, settle these suits, maybe get the administration to focus elsewhere. The administration can claim victory, and the news organization can move on. But I think what organizations, institutions are starting to realize is that that strategy doesn't work. Once you cave, then there's this perception that you will continue to cave. And so I think that news organizations and universities who had caved early on and paid these fines and settled these suits are discovering that that wasn't the solution. That's not the way it works. And so I'm thinking that we're starting to see more pushback than we did early on. But I think there was just, at the beginning, people are not used to this particular, strategy. It is a strategy that Donald Trump has used throughout his career, to just have lawsuits, tie up kind of their institutions and the legal system, and have things drag on and on. And I just think that the initial thought was, okay, we can get over this. We'll move on, and he'll move on to the next victim. But again, it doesn't seem to work that way. It's just just an example, it's not a media example, but the New York Times had announced that Trump was going to be forgiving the $200 million fine against Harvard. And then next thing you know, he gets annoyed that that's reported, and now it's $1 billion fine. So, there's kind of no way to win. And I think that news organizations are starting to realize that.
When it comes to some of the electronic media, CBS, NBC, ABC, and the like, is it also a function of the authority that the FCC has over their licenses, which they don't have over print media? Is that a part of it as well?
I think so. I think that, and particularly the way that the FCC has, been behaving in terms of threatening to pull licenses and, kind of putting restrictions on different news organizations, or at least threatening to do so. I think that has a lot to do with it. I mean, we've not had a situation, kind of in recent decades where we have an FCC chairman who is so willing to go along with the administration's agenda of trying to crush legacy news media and to use the authority of that agency to do so. So I think that the threat of those kinds of sanctions is real, and I think that kind of the legacy media are they're holding on, some more than others, but they're holding on in some instances by a thread. So these kinds of threats are really something that news organizations take seriously.
I want to go back for a little bit because the reality of disinformation and yellow journalism, as you well know, is not new. Joseph Pulitzer did it, and many others did. In fact, Benjamin Franklin did it when he was around writing the Constitution. But what is different about today in terms of the disinformation and yellow journalism? What's the difference between today and what it was during the days of Joseph Pulitzer as well as William Hearst?
Yeah, that's a really great question and an interesting comparison to make. I think that the biggest difference is that the media system today is, kind of has so many more outlets and different dimensions. Social media has really changed the entire dynamic. And at the time of Hearst and Pulitzer, the misinformation and the yellow journalism was being spread through print media. That was a slow form of, communication. Also required that people at the time had to be able to read it, and so there was, misinformation was rampant. Both Joseph Pulitzer's allegedly, you provide the pictures and I'll provide the war, or that was Hearst, I guess. But now it's just a fire hose of misinformation that comes out at such a rapid pace, and it's impossible to really keep pace with it, and even to correct it in any way. And so I think the big difference is the fact that we have, electronic media, but specifically digital media that's uncontrolled by any kinds of norms or rules or professional practices. And social media can get out ahead of, legacy media, get this misinformation into the pipeline. Sometimes it gets picked up by the legacy media, and that even elevates misinformation. So I think the big difference is the nature of the communication system, and the way that misinformation today is promoted. We also have now kind of echo chambers where misinformation can flourish and becomes embellished. People, ordinary citizens can be, part of an ecosystem, echo chamber that's promoting, conspiracy theories, misinformation, and they, actually can take part in building that, kind of bank of misinformation and become, in terms of echo chambers, kind of esteemed members of those communities. And so it becomes a way that people can promote themselves by contributing to the flow of misinformation without consequence. And I think that that's another part of it. I mean, the situation now, even, I'm kind of a great believer that, education, particularly, media literacy education should be designed to help, young people kind of developed those skills to be able to identify misinformation, but teachers are reporting it's becoming overwhelming to them. They, just even if they've had the training to try and identify misinformation, help their students do it, it just comes at such, a rapid pace, and there's just such a fire hose of misinformation. It's impossible for them to even use these skills effectively. And with AI getting into the mix, and kind of now it can produce pictures and images to go along with kind of misinformation and reinforce it, I think the situation is becoming even more grave.
I want to stay with the notion of social media for a minute, and I want to quote the philosopher Umberto Eco, who said the following: "Social media gives legions of idiots the right to speak when they once only spoke at a bar after a glass of wine without harming the community. But now they have the same right to speak as a Nobel Prize winner. It's the invasion of the idiots." Unquote. Is he right? And if he is, how do you then begin to combat that?
Well, I hate to say it, but I believe that he is right. And, I don't like to call people idiots, but does give people without, kind of any skills in reporting information and news, this, as he said, the same access, the same agency as a Nobel Prize winner. And I would say in some instances, they would have, even more influence because they're talking to peers, they're talking to people who are, share their same viewpoints, and who are considered to be, kind of at one in a community. And so, any individual, any idiot, can get involved in, kind of promoting misinformation or, kind of elevating any kind of, rumor, falsehood, conspiracy theory, at, kind of that has the same clout. And I would argue in some instances more clout than someone like a Nobel Prize winner, just because of the fact that people have become so insular in their communities and so much more willing to believe people who are part of, kind of the group that they consider themselves to be aligned with. The big question is, how do we really control this? And I contemplate that a lot, particularly, even here at Georgetown, misinformation comes into the classroom all the time. And it's a difficult thing to try and, kind of correct it. Sometimes you can. But I think that the level of distrust of not only the news media, but also of people who are not, part of your particular, kind of group that you associate yourself with, makes it hard to find a source that, could be used to counter misinformation. I think a lot of this has to do with the rise of affective polarization in the US, where, we don't trust our neighbors, we don't trust one another. We become so, kind of oriented towards, only being with the people that we feel that we agree with, and we despise the people who are different from us, kind of some people. And I think that creates a condition, a cultural condition where it's really difficult to correct misinformation. And like I said, I do believe that it's essential to have media literacy education. It's not as widely available as one would think. Teachers do feel as if they lack the capacity to do that, that they don't have many opportunities to get the professional learning training that they need to be able to do that. But I have a colleague who feels that, it is possible to just, kind of have a mechanism for countering misinformation, maybe an alternative news program where all the sources are trusted. I'm not convinced that the findings show that that's really going to be effective. Not that many people would tune into that show. We've seen in other countries it has worked. South Korea has some successful experiments with, kind of fact-checking news through, these alternative news or news programming. I'm not so sure that it would be something that would be successful, kind of here. I mean, this is how do you put misinformation, kind of back into the bottle in a way, because it's just so rampant and it's become the norm. I think that that's just a real tough one.
And I wanted to stay with that because you do have some sources, Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. You also have ProPublica, nonprofit. But as you say, I'm not sure that they would break through in the way we would expect them to. Because just because they're listed as a 501c3 does not necessarily mean that they're going to be trusted by the masses of people. So what are some of the other alternatives that people can look to? Because when we did the lead up to this particular segment, Trump has made the news the subject, where it used to be the news media organizations were simply carriers of the message or of the news of the day. They've become the story itself. So, what can be created that enables people to agree, at least on what the basic facts are of any particular given story?
Yeah, so I also I do appreciate these organizations that are out there, ProPublica and factcheck.org, these organizations that they basically are designed to try and even in real time kind of check facts of what political leaders are saying. And they do really excellent work, and they do act as somewhat of a check on what's the information that's getting out there, but the audiences for those sources are really small. They're people who are very interested, in politics, and probably, higher socioeconomic status, that even, there's not a tremendous amount of awareness. So I have been kind of thinking about what are, kind of some of the ways that we might be seeing some trends or pushbacks against it. And one of them is starting to be what we would think of as sort of an unlikely source. And that is that we're starting to see us, kind of a little bit of a resurgence in local news. And local news is very relevant to people. They trust it more than national news. And, that it's more relevant to people because it deals with their community and events and things that are happening. And, for, at least 2 or 3 decades now, we've seen a decline in local newspapers, a decline in, kind of local news sources. But I just started to look at some recent trends that are showing that there's been kind of a reinvention of local news that's starting in some places. So relying much more on kind of grassroots digital types of sources, but that also successful local news organizations have started to ramp up their outreach to the community, like actually becoming more involved in community affairs. So they've been having, town meetings, or they've been going to libraries to have special events. And so the outreach within the community has been, through a few studies that I've just recently seen, seems to be kind of catching on, and seems to be, kind of the beginnings of a successful model that we might see the resurgence of local news. And one thing about the local news organization that I saw in this, kind of preliminary study, was that they do tend to focus more on facts. They're not looking at, kind of national news where a lot of the misinformation, comes from. But, they are really trying to tell people this is what's really going on in your community. And, these are things that you need to pay attention to. And here's some resources for you. So I'm not saying that this is a huge, trend, or that its impact is going to be felt immediately. But I think we are starting to see, kind of where local news was considered to be pretty much, kind of, if it wasn't dead, it was dying. It's just starting to come back. And there's been, different organizations, Knight Foundations and others that have been putting resources there. And that has been helping with this kind of change in the way that local news is, kind of reaching people. And that could be one counter to it. I also have seen that, while we may say that the cable news can spread misinformation. There actually has been, well, right after, I guess for the first year or so of the Trump administration, uh, MSNBC, CNN started to see their viewership, kind of declined. It's now starting to have a resurgence for shows that, can be a counter to the dominant message that's out there. So I'm starting to see maybe there's some, kind of maybe something of a pushback against all the misinformation, the outright lies, and things that I think news, news consumers consider a lot of, kind of I'll just say the outright lies to be an insult to their intelligence. You're telling us this and we're seeing something different. And so, I don't know. I'm just saying that this is not huge trends that I'm seeing, but, kind of small steps in a direction that might counter some of the misinformation.
I think following up with your comments in terms of what the public is receiving, I think one of the places where it has had a big effect is in Minnesota, for example, with the killing of Renee Good
Yes.
and Alex Preddy, and where the administration tried to create a narrative that the general public understands simply is not true. And I think that's the beginning of a trend where perhaps there will be more emphasis placed on skepticism within government circles, where it should be, quite frankly, as opposed to media circles, where, I mean, skepticism is due there as well. But I want to follow up also on where media has become the center of attraction. For example, you have Barry Weiss now at CBS. You have Larry Ellison, who tried to buy Warner Brothers. And, you have the Washington Post and two incidents. First, you have a firing of almost a third of the staff of the news organization. But you also have where one of his reporters had a raid on her home, and the owner of the paper, Jeff Bezos, said nary a word unless he said something recently that I simply haven't noticed. What is behind all of these folks seemingly kowtowing to administration? Is it fear, or is it in the case of a Jeff Bezos who wants his Blue Origin company to get contracts from the government as well? What's driving their seemingly fear of the administration, including Barry Weiss?
Yeah, I actually think that a lot of it's less fear and more the anticipation that you're going to get favored treatment by the administration if you kind of go along with, kind of with the anti-media, kind of push that the Trump administration has been promoting, of course, for years now. I think the raid on Hannah Nathanson's home was really telling. She's been a reporter. She's a very good reporter, but she kind of is a reporter who gets major stories but does it kind of below the radar. She was somebody that a lot of people in Washington would speak to. She actually apparently had some sources inside the White House who would, kind of give her, kind of information. She had a lot of people who were willing to talk to her, and kind of feed information. She was noted for her coverage or hard-hitting coverage of the January 6th, kind of uh, ride on the Capitol. And so she actually anticipated this. Apparently, she had been threatened before, and so she kept all of her notes and everything were encrypted. But they came in, stormed her home, and took all of her computer equipment, including her smartwatch. This is chilling. And so I guess in cases like that, if you're looking at kind of reporters who are on the ground trying to do their job and being threatened in this way, I think that's fear. I think in the case of billionaires, it's for some reason they want more power and more money, and they want the favors out of the government. So I think it depends on kind of where you stand in this perspective. It's are you a reporter trying to do your job? Are you, kind of a reporter at 60 Minutes, for example, who's done a great story on ECOT and then it gets, quashed and eventually, kind of shown, but after a whole bunch of controversy? Or are you somebody who, kind of has billions of dollars, aspires to have more power and more money, and so you take the kinds of actions that Jeff Bezos and others are taking. I think that merger, the Warner Brothers Discovery, I mean, clearly, I mean, he almost isn't even subtle about it. It's Ellison. It's just, I want this. I'm going to make certain moves so that I can get it to curry favor. And, the Trump administration doesn't even seem to be, kind of hiding it. It's almost like there's these deals being made in plain sight.
Oh, the question then for a lot of us is what can the general public do? One, to restore the confidence within our news media, because it is highly polarized right now. You have Fox News on this side, you have MS Now on the other side, and CNN comes up the middle somewhere. But what can the general public do to combat this notion of disinformation, of attacks on journalists, as has been done with Ms. Nathanson as well as Don Lemon and others? What can the public do?
I think the public is starting. I think first, you've mentioned Minneapolis, and the fact that the administration was pushing a narrative that was just not supported by the evidence, and the fact that individuals, people themselves, have been out there recording, what they see on their phones and sharing the videos along with what they've witnessed, and basically exposing the fact that a lot of what the government is trying to say about kind of really contentious events did not happen the way that they are trying to spin it. So I think one thing, maybe if we look at Minneapolis as a microcosm of the way that citizens, when they've had enough, can push back, and they do have, we have the power to be able to, counter the narrative with real evidence, and get people to understand that, what's often being kind of sold to us as kind of the reality is not that. So I think that's one way, is that people are becoming more aware of the fact that they're being manipulated, or there's attempts to manipulate people, and that what we are witnessing with our own eyes, and through kind of true people who are recording these things, is real. The other thing that I find heartening is that the New York Times, and there are other news organizations as well, and unfortunately, the Washington Post, with Jeff Bezos, I think has fallen out of that category, but largely, and the loss of really excellent reporters and columnists, Eugene Robinson and others, who've gone elsewhere. The Atlantic, for example, which does a good job of kind of reporting on things. Um, Quality news organizations like that are seeing their audiences increase. And so I think there is, on the part of the at least some segments of the public, a desire to get quality news, and quality news in the case of the New York Times, is definitely showing to be, a productive business model because they are getting more and more, kind of subscribers. They're doing well financially, and the quality of their reporting, their investigative reporting, has actually increased because they're able to put more resources into it. So I think there is some pushback that's starting to happen. I think the one thing is that, we all have to remember that we are witnesses to history too, and that we have the power now through social media and through, kind of the platforms that we have access to, easy access to, that we can get the word out when we see something and when we have, kind of some, kind of factual information or observations to share.
One of the things about and the media, we've been really covering this from a news perspective, but the culture is also important when it comes to the media as well. And two events that are presently going on, the Epstein files and what's happening with that, and even MAGA seems to be upset about that, but also the recent halftime at the Super Bowl in Bad Bunny. And the administration thought that it could turn the country against that, but it seemed to have had the opposite effect, that the ratings for Bad Bunny dwarfed the so-called alternative halftime show. So is that part of the process in terms of an organic pushback, I think, as you were alluding to, by the public that says, I'm not accepting that anymore. I hear what you're trying to say. We don't accept it anymore. But is that part of the solution, an organic pushback by the population, not only in terms of news, but also in terms of the culture and how it's presented and the like? I mean, what's your opinion on that?
The pushback, more something that's happened kind of organically, as particularly through culture and kind of even popular media. I actually think that is really the case. First of all, I am a season ticket holder of the Baltimore Ravens, and what I noticed happening in the stadium throughout the season was kind of these little subtle pushbacks that I would see in the way that every Sunday, kind of football, every football game, there's a lot of pageantry or whatever, but there are little things like that with on the scoreboard occasionally when they were trying to get us to cheer louder. They would say something like, some people may say that this is fake, and just kind of making little jokes about things. When I saw Bad Bunny and that halftime show and the cheers, and just the kind of the celebration, I thought, football has probably the Super Bowl has probably one of the biggest audiences, kind of bigger than the president when he makes any speech. And apparently it had one of the large 130 million people tuned into that halftime performance compared to, I think it was 6 or 7 million. I'm not sure that to the alternative one. But just the fact that it was there at the Super Bowl celebrating, kind of the diversity of our country and the idea of love versus hate. I just thought that the message was so powerful, and that has been resonating through, media, through social media. It's been a topic of discussion, and I think it's also starting to have some repercussions for the midterms. I've seen that, the disparaging of Bad Bunny is turning off Latino voters who had kind of shifted into the Republican Trump camp. And there's some concerns that there's districts in Texas that are traditionally Republican or have been redistricted that way, may not turn out that way. So I do think that we're seeing kind of the public itself saying, we've had enough. And there's, kind of ways that in our daily lives, we don't live the way that the Trump administration is trying to, kind of push us towards. Most people don't live, kind of with, hate in their hearts towards their neighbor. And, people are overwhelmingly against the way that this immigration situation is being handled. And we're seeing things, just images that are coming up, like little Liam, who was, sent to a detention camp in his bunny hat. People are just reacting as compassionate human beings. And I think that pushback is probably eventually going to win out. That's my hopeful thought.
I was speaking to Marlene Wind from the University of Copenhagen recently, and I'd asked her the question, will the relationships between the United States and Europe return to where it was, with all of its tensions and the like? So I don't want to be naive about that. But she said it will, but it will probably take a generation. And so I want to ask you the same question in the moments we have left, that are we able to regain trust of the media, or is that also going to take, like Marlene Wynn said, at least a generation to recapture that trust that the public used to have with its media?
I think that, again, I want to be optimistic and, things like you pointed out, the fact that, kind of the pressure about the Epstein files and that the public wants to know the truth and the, kind of the Super Bowl halftime. But what's happened in Minneapolis. These are things that I think are positive developments that give me hope that ultimately we will be able to, kind of reclaim not only trust in the media, but trust in our government and, kind of repair the relationships that have happened, our international relationships. And I think it's going to take a long time. At first, I thought, well, when things were happening so rapidly at the beginning of the Trump administration, I thought, well, there's going to be such pushback and immediately this is going to change. Clearly, that's not going to be the case. And we're probably going to have to weather 4 years of this, maybe, 2 really bad years, and, might get a little better after the midterms. But I think there has to be kind of house cleaning that takes place. There has to be turnover in government, and I think that that then government and the media themselves have to play a role in trying to restore public trust. A lot of this, I guess I've been kind of focusing on the negative. Kind of views that the Trump administration has, not even negative, just the, portraying the media as evil, the enemy, and all of those things as, kind of the primary driver of, negative views of the media. But even for years before Trump even came into office, the media have been, becoming more commercialized. And with that, a lot of their own standards had been, becoming more lax. It was becoming much more infotainment instead of real hard news coverage. And so public's, distrust of the media has started before Trump. He just was able to amplify that and hasten it so that now, the trust in the media is at a level that, we've never seen before in terms of how low it is. But I do think that, even as we're seeing these subtle changes that we've been talking about a bit, that ultimately, it'll take a while, but we will be able to recover from this.
You are a big proponent of civic education. And one article you have written, The Challenge of Misinformation in the Civics Classroom. Could you speak a little bit more about that? And what do you utilize to combat that?
Yes. So I did a study of teachers asking them, first of all, how much of a problem did they think misinformation was in society and in the classroom? And then asking them, kind of where did they see kind of the biggest challenge in the classroom in terms of where is misinformation entering in discussions in the classroom? And then what kinds of strategies are they taking to try and combat misinformation? And so overwhelmingly, teachers feel that that misinformation is a huge problem in society, and slightly less in the classroom, but still, an overwhelming number of teachers said that it was really something that's become a real problem in their classrooms. And I looked at a number of places where misinformation could enter into the classroom. So news stories, social media, and information that they get from word of mouth, or from parents, peers, or friends. And basically, if misinformation is coming in from all of those places at a high level in the classroom. But the one thing that I found most fascinating was that teachers felt that they were most prepared to counter misinformation that comes in through news media. Um, they were somewhat reluctant to counter misinformation from social media, and they were very reluctant to counter misinformation that a student might bring in from their parents, or kind of even parents' friends or peers or whatever, because they felt that doing that might cause them to kind of be criticized, or even, a couple said so far as, if you challenge a child who brings in misinformation from a parent, the parent might go to the school board and ask for some sort of, kind of punishment of the teacher, or they might lose their jobs. I mean, it is that severe. So some of the tactics that they've been using, in addition to kind of media literacy training to help students identify these are the characteristics of misinformation. When you see these things, go and check it out, from multiple sources. Here's a list of sources that are, more reliable, and you should cross-check things. They also are using kind of less personal ways of countering misinformation. So there's a lot of tools that are out there, kind of online tools that students can use to detect misinformation. So there's a lot of companies out there that are creating these educational tools. Some are good, some are, kind of less good. But teachers seem to be more willing to use those kinds of resources, as opposed to correcting a student on their own, because here it's, kind of through a platform, and it's not, them telling the student that, this is not correct, or this is a conspiracy theory, or whatever. So, but the one thing also that came through is that um, most of the teachers felt that they were underprepared to deal with the deluge of misinformation, that they needed more training in successful strategies for countering misinformation in the classroom, and especially for dealing, kind of with this misinformation that comes in through word of mouth, especially what they're getting in the home.
Have you been hopeful about the techniques that have been utilized to combat disinformation?
Yeah, so actually, I am hopeful because I currently have a big study in the field looking at teachers who have used these different kinds of tools, anything from videos that are, short videos, which are very resonant with particularly young children. To help them understand what misinformation is, lesson plans that incorporate, kind of how do you discover misinformation, how do you correct for that. So I've been actually studying that. I had a pilot study that just came out of the field, and I just finished analyzing it, and it actually shows that that the interesting thing is that students start out thinking that they can identify misinformation. They know a lot. They're very confident in their own ability to counter misinformation or whatever. And then when they are in their class, and after they've taken, the class that has, use these tools, they discover that maybe they shouldn't be so confident, that misinformation is more prevalent than they believed, and that their own capacity to really challenge it, they need to kind of temper their confidence, and really start to acquire actual skills. So I think that's also something that I looked into some other studies that people are finding among adults as well, that people feel, oh, I can always tell misinformation. I can figure it out myself. And then, when confronted with it, they actually are not quite as astute at identifying and dealing with misinformation as they think they are. So what I found is that classes that are incorporating these kinds of tools are giving students a more realistic view of their own capacity to recognize misinformation, and also helping them to develop skills so that they can, kind of basically identify misinformation and come up with ways of, at least challenging it and fact checking. So I'm very hopeful. Problem is that these kinds of resources are not widely available in schools. I look particularly at the way they're incorporated into the civics classroom, but my belief is that given that misinformation is so prevalent, it needs to be incorporated across the curriculum. Science, for example, there's so much misinformation about science that's out there, and very rarely are students in science classes given the skills or capacity to recognize that this is not factual information about science, which is a hard something that's supposed to be kind of much more grounded in kind of hard facts and data. But more and more misinformation is being disseminated there, and yet in science classes, the ability to develop these skills is rarely, kind of part of the curriculum.
My guest today has been Diana Owen, professor of political science at Georgetown University. Dr. Owen, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated it.
And join us again next week as we tackle another subject of global importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective.